Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, March 24th. And where do you want to start today? The Middle East, is that the biggest story right now in your mind, or is it Russia, Ukraine?
Well, yeah, those are close contenders. Be honest, I think it's a toss-up.
Really?
We could start with either of them.
Okay, well, maybe we start with Russia, Ukraine, because I haven't been paying as close attention. My Twitter feed, X feed's been filled with, horrors out of Gaza, so that's been on my mind more. So maybe you tell me what's going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Okay, well, um, on the battlefronts, I think it's pretty much more of the same. Uh, Continual Russian advances, continual attrition. There's nothing really dramatic to report. But but something I think that we should bring up is the role of drones. I mean, I know you've brought that up before, and you were right to do so. You were pointing out that, well, no matter what, the Ukrainian forces have drones. Maybe they've run out of all these other things, or they're running out. We shouldn't say they've run out, but they're, running out of tanks and the other kind of, machinery of war and, the shells and so, artillery shells and so on and so forth. But they have drones. That's something that they can actually manufacture locally, and they've proven to be very adept at that. Um, Yeah, a recent article was actually by Simplicius, the thinker, addressed the role of drones, and he he says, its role has been growing throughout this war. This is really the first drone war in the history of human warfare. At the beginning, the Ukrainians had a definite edge. The Russians really hadn't prepared for it. But the Russians have since taken the lead in both in quantity and quality. But it's not, an overwhelming lead. They definitely have the edge in drones, but the Ukrainians still have enough drones that the Russians have to be cautious. Maybe one reason why we haven't seen any of these big aero offensives. At some point, of course, it may come, but the fact is that there's still a lot of drones in the sky, a lot of Ukrainian drones in the sky. It means that you have to be careful about what you do. You have to be to let's say reduce activity in the open to a minimum. So we see that. Now, I know early in the war that we found that artillery was really king, as it was even in World War One and in previous wars. That something like in those past wars, 80% of casualties were actually caused by artillery, and we're seeing similar figures in the first, let's say, year and a half or 2 years of this war. But that has since changed. Now we're looking at, maybe something like 50% of casualties are actually caused by drones. So the the number of casualties caused by artillery is way down. It's really changed. Now, still, the Russians have an advantage in drones. They have an absolute advantage in the air, and they have a near absolute advantage in artillery, and so the advantage is entirely to the Russians, and they continue to get stronger. But drones, that's a real challenge, and I don't think it's going to go away again because the Ukrainians are able to manufacture these drones often in small workshops underground, dispersed throughout the country. So, occasionally the Russians will get them with a missile, but they can't really stop it entirely. And what we have happening there is a kind of a drones uh, arms race. Both sides are continually developing, new attack technologies, but also new defense technologies. We've seen the introduction first by the Russians of the fiber optic cable drones. Now I believe the Ukrainians have them too, and now we're seeing AI drones. And both of these, with fiber optic and the AI, can overcome electronic warfare because they don't depend on signals from some base. Or, in the case of fiber optic, of course, there's a signal, but it travels through the fiber and therefore is impervious to EW. So yeah, this is what we're seeing. But then there's new EW being developed that can actually, fry circuit boards and yeah, and so on and so forth. This is really where so much of the war is centered on now, is on drones. So that's what I have to say about the battle. Again, I don't think there have been, they continue to be Russian advances, but no dramatic breakthroughs. Still talk of some sort of major offensive, either in the north, the Kharkov region, or maybe, Sumy, or maybe Zaporozhye, or maybe both. It just, we've heard talk of this, like I've said, for years, actually since it began, and it hasn't happened. But one day it may happen. It's just when the Russians assess that the Ukrainian lines are brittle enough, and the forces have been weakened, Ukrainian forces have been weakened sufficiently that they may opt for a big aero offensive. And so we might. I wouldn't really put a whole lot of money on it, but we might see a major offensive when the mud season, the Rasputitsa, ends, which should be in a few weeks from now.
Okay. Yeah, speaking of drones, I'm sure you saw that footage of this drone attack in Kherson on a roof. Some people were repairing a roof or on a rooftop working, and then a drone came down, and then Twitter was just everybody was going on how this was Russia's targeting civilians in Kherson. Do you know anything about that story? Was that
Actually, I don't.
you haven't seen?
I don't know.
Did you see it or?
No, I haven't. I didn't see that. I missed that one.
Okay, yeah, it's always tough for me to when I see these things. I don't know if they're being used as propaganda or if it's potentially a false flag, or maybe Russia did target these people or who these people were. But I know that was a trending story for a little while.
Right. Yeah. Well, I would point out the fact that
losing you.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, anyway, you were just mentioning this incident in the Kherson region where apparently a Russian drone targeted some people who were civilians who were repairing a roof. Maybe it happens. There are always some bad apples in every army in history, and certainly in the U.S. Army and in any army. So it could have been a Russian attack. But I think I would point out the fact that this has become news tells you how it's if indeed that's what it was, it tells you that it's an exception to the rule. Because the thing is, those kind of things happen every day in Russian held territories. Civilians are attacked, in their homes, in their cars, on marketplaces. It just happens every day. And so it's not even news. Now, this has happened once apparently, in Ukrainian held territory. And it's news, and that tells you, I think that speaks volumes about the actual situation. It's not something that the Russians do systematically or whatever. I'm sure there are occasional bad apples and accidents and that kind of thing. Now, one thing, again, Kherson, let's not forget, that is considered Russian territory, and the people that live there, by and large are supporters of Russia, are Russian speaking. They voted in a referendum, back in 2022 to become a part of Russia. I think in Kherson it was something like 85%. So it's again, it's not impossible, but it seems highly unlikely that the Russians would be targeting civilians. It's just, first of all, something they don't do, especially they know that they have reason to assume that these are really their own people. Why would they be doing that in territory that they want to recapture and they intend to govern? Why would they be targeting civilians? It doesn't make a bit of sense to me.
Right, but that was kind of my assumption as well. But you don't know, and it's hard to counter it. Once right. These stories start expire, pick up traction, they just keep on moving, and there's not really much of a counter to it. So I just was curious about it. But what are some developments on the diplomatic front? Are we seeing anything change?
There are negotiations ongoing in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Yesterday, the Americans met with the Ukrainians and spent several hours, something like 8 hours, in negotiations with them. We don't know how those went, if there was any outcome, because both sides were tight-lipped afterwards, which probably indicates that it didn't go very well. Today, the Russians are meeting with the Americans again in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. And I think they're specifically, at least I think according to the American side, they're going to discuss some kind of moratorium of attacks on the Black Sea. And I don't really know what this is going to entail. It's not clear to me. You know, I listened to that interview of Steve Witkoff, the one conducted by Tucker Carlson, and he mentioned that, and he said, well, like this moratoriums, like all attacks on Russian ships would be halted, and then all attacks on Ukrainian ships. He was actually referring to naval vessels. The thing is, Ukraine does not have a navy. Russia does, Ukraine doesn't. So it obviously has to be more than that. It's probably about commercial shipping, but anyway, we can get into that later, maybe when we discuss. So I don't know what they're trying to do there. I don't know exactly what this moratorium would entail. It's not clear to me, but that supposedly is what they're discussing.
Do you think there's a risk that Ukraine could turn on the United States? You said that they're tight-lipped. It sounds like the Ukrainians and the Americans aren't getting along very well.
Yeah.
They have a lot of reason to be upset. Ukraine does. Do you think there's a chance of that?
Well, I have to say there is. You know, it seems like a rational Ukraine leadership would do everything it possibly could do to mollify the U.S. leadership, you know, to maybe to string them along or whatever, but because they are so dependent on the U.S. And the fact is that they truly cannot survive without U.S. support. It seems to me, you know, that's obvious, and they should know that. But Zelensky, and not just Zelensky, a lot of them just seem to be unable to shut up. And they have, you know, since the most recent meetings, they've gone back to their just, you know, maximalist positions. Yeah, no surrender of territory, including Crimea. That's ours. You know, maybe we won't get it right away, but that's ours. You know, membership in NATO, everything, all those, you know, those red lines that Russian declared red lines. You know, they're crossing them and you know, insisting that that they haven't budged an inch. So, yeah, you know, again, you know, these are. Ideological zealots. I think they're in the grips of kind of hysteria, and they possibly, you know, could, just as you know, we've seen examples of this in the past, you know, really attack the U.S. It would be, seems to me, just terribly foolish. But you know, they don't seem to me to be entirely rational people. They could.
How could they turn on the U.S.? Like, what would they do? You know, actually,
well, I mean, it's not like they're going to attack. It would be, you know, it would be in the, it would be rhetoric. You know, it would be verbal attacks. You know, what else are they going to do?
What about terrorism?
I don't see that. I mean, well, it could happen somewhere down the road. You know, especially if they're clearly going down to defeat. Like, you know, we're in the last days and Kiev is falling or something, or Lvov is falling. You know, we don't know how far this is going to go. And then there could be just this nihilistic rage where they just lash out at different perceived enemies, and the U.S. could be among them. You know, it's true that could happen somewhere down the road. I don't see that happening now. I mean, I think they want support from the U.S. They're going to demand it, but they'll continue to do it. But they may demand it, you know, in a way that angers the U.S. You know, as we've seen already. You know, they've shown some improvement. I think, like Zelensky has been careful to always say thank you, you know, where he didn't say that before. But it clearly is. It takes a lot of effort on their part to do that. I mean, not just Zelensky, but some of his aides. It's just not the. It's, you know, they clearly are angry and they have trouble containing their emotions. So we'll see. You know, maybe it won't amount to anything, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see some more conflicts, you know, spats like the one that we saw in the Oval Office.
Right. No, I completely understand their anger. You know, they were promised so many things by the U.S. They were really pushed into this, and now it's all falling apart, and so many people have died, and so many people have fled the country, and then the United States is saying, is getting mad at it, saying like, "No, we can't help you. We don't. We were just joking about all that other stuff we promised you in the past. We're out of here. You guys need to say thank you more." And they're the ones that have
Uh-huh.
lost so much.
Yeah,
So that
yeah, no, you have a point. You have a point. Yeah.
right. Okay, well, you brought up the Tucker interview with Steve Woodcock. I watched it. I found that to be quite illuminating, kind of our first kind of real insight into the Trump administration's sort of the mind of Trump in a way through Steve Woodcock. Maybe you could tell us your impression of it and your key takeaways from that interview.
Okay, well, the first half of the interview was really focused on the Middle East. And I found that actually difficult to listen to because it was just the same old propaganda. There, you didn't really see any deviation from the Zionist orthodoxies. It might as well have been Anthony Blinken being interviewed by Tucker Carlson. I don't think there wasn't just even a hair's breadth of difference. And that's what I feared. That was quite unfortunate. I guess that's all I need to say about it. I mean, he had clearly had taken the Zionist line, the Netanyahu administration, not just Zionist, but really it's the Netanyahu administration within Israel, which is really to say the far right. He had adopted their view of things entirely, taking it hook, line, and sinker. There was just, I didn't see any evidence that, that he was actually kind of trying to think out of the box there. He was very much in the box. And there just was a complete lack of empathy for the Palestinians. And it just didn't seem to, it was just so clear by so many of his statements that he didn't really, he wasn't concerned with their suffering. Or sometimes there were some expressions, but they just seemed like, kind of pro forma. It didn't seem to me to come from the heart. It was, and by many of his statements, it's clear that he didn't regard Palestinian lives as really the loss of Palestinian life to be a matter of great concern. So anyway, that was on the Middle East. He also, maybe before we go to Russia, he also expressed support for al-Jawlani, the ex-Al Qaeda, ex-ISIS leader, who is now the leader, the president of Syria, and there he's actually maybe out of step, not just with reality, but even with his own government, because again, recently the U.S. joined Russia in condemning the al-Jawlani government, for the massacres that have occurred on the West Coast. And either he wasn't aware of that or he didn't care. And then he's even out of step with the Israelis because the Israelis condemned him too. So anyway, that's just a kind of a footnote to his discussion of the Middle East.
So something he brought up in the Middle East as well is he was saying that the Israelis showed him a video of what happened on October 7th and just how horrible it was, and that this can never happen again, and that Hamas is just, they're just evil, basically. Right. But in the video, he talked about beheaded babies, or I don't know if he said babies, but beheadings.
Beheading and mass rapes.
Mass rapes, right. He brought up the mass rapes in the video, and I'm wondering, nobody has seen this video. I have heard about this that a select few special people get shown the special video that the Israelis have, and then they come out of it and say, it's just too awful. You don't even want to think about it. You can't even imagine. I stand with Israel 100%. Hamas has got to go. They're completely justified in what they're doing in Gaza. Right. This comes up time and time again, but nobody has seen this video. Nobody in the public. So does this video even exist? Or if it does, is it a Hollywood production, something that they've manufactured? Where is this coming from? I find this odd that they keep on talking about that people are shown this video, but why can't we see it? We see horrible things on X all the time, what Israel's committing in Gaza. Why can't you think that Israel would want to show as much as possible, as much airtime as possible of what happened on October 7th, but we don't see it?
I'm sure it exists. If they're not showing this particular video or releasing it to the public is probably because so much of it is easily debunked, like the mass rapes, which has been debunked repeatedly. That I think that's probably why it's not shown. But Netanyahu continues to make those claims, even about the beheaded babies and babies in ovens, and all those things have been debunked, long ago. But he still says them, and it it continues to have an impact. A lot of people really want to believe in it. The thing is, like, it's important, I think, to those people who support Israel unconditionally to believe in it. Otherwise, you have to start thinking about the suffering of the Palestinian people. I would say that even if you believe that video, even if you believe there were mass rapes, even if you believe the story that, there were 1,200 people, all of them were killed by Hamas, you regard them as 1,200 murders. Well, that was a year and a half ago. And since then, we have, at least 50, 60,000 Palestinians, the great majority of whom were civilians, actually women and children, and probably hundreds of thousands, at least a couple 100,000 dead, indirectly because of this attack. At some point you say, okay, even if that's true, at what point does that become just overwhelmed by the suffering that has been inflicted upon this population? You have to stop and think. I mean, obviously Witkoff didn't. It's being used as for a justification for the genocide up to now, and for continued genocide. Again, I think you could go through and probably debunk more than half of the claims that are made in that video, whatever it is. Or maybe all of them, I don't know, because I haven't seen it, like, as you point out. But even if, you allow for it, even if you somehow believe the stories that are made, that have been spread, it still doesn't absolve Israel of the charge of genocide.
Right. Yeah. And so you think, this video that they're showing people, you think it's probably fabricated? Half of it is just manufactured, mixed in with real footage, and then they throw in things with like babies in ovens and rapes that they have actors or CGI. Is that probably what it is?
It could very well be. It could very well be. That's one thing is, it's like visual footage really is something that in our day and age, it's easy to create a sort of almost a hyper reality, through videos. Sometimes movies, for example, can seem more real than reality. It's something that we can do, and you feel like, yeah, I really saw it. It's really there. This is so horrible, and I can't, I have to, therefore, support Netanyahu and the IDF, unconditionally, because I felt it. I was there, but no, you weren't there. And you need to ask the questions like, is this actually real? Okay, they showed me this, but let's stop. Wait a second. They have a huge incentive to, shape my views of this. And it's obviously the incentive is to exaggerate the wrongdoings of the other side, and to, maybe not discuss, their own fault for this incident. For example, as we discussed earlier, on that day, October 7th, it's clear that the Hannibal Directive was put in effect. That's been admitted to by the IDF. It has been reported in Israeli, papers. And the Hannibal Directive, of course, is a license or an actual instruction to kill Israelis who are in danger of becoming hostages, because the IDF thinks, this is something, hostages puts them at a disadvantage. It gives strength to the enemy. So rather than allow the enemy to take these hostages, we're going to kill the hostages along with the enemy. And it's clear that that was in effect. We don't know how many Israelis were killed by the IDF on that day, but it could very well, it probably was in the hundreds. So, that 1,200 figure, first of all, half of them were soldiers. So we're not talking about murders. These are not, our war crimes or anything. this is an occupied people that has been under attack by the Israelis for a long time. They strike back, they kill, IDF soldiers. That's war. That's all it is. Now, the civilians, attacks on civilians, those are all potential war crimes. I agree. And I'm sure some of them are. But it's unclear how many of those civilians were in fact killed by the IDF. So the whole thing has been, even putting aside all the beheaded baby nonsense and mass rape nonsense and all that, if you just look at that statistic, which is repeated again and again, that statistic is suspect and is actually, clearly doesn't reflect the let's say the horror, or it clearly is not evidence in itself of the malevolence of Hamas. It just doesn't work. So anyway, yeah, there's just been an obvious manipulation, an attempt to milk, every October 7th for all it's worth, to justify, the horrors that that Israel is inflicting upon the Gazans.
Right. It's infuriating as an American to see how much Israel has manipulated the emotions of Americans, have purchased our congressmen and our senators, much of our government, how involved and how controlling they've been. And I'm wondering, do you think that, I think that this will backfire though on the Israelis, that because once people realize that they've been manipulated, I mean, maybe some people will refuse to ever think that they've been manipulated,
No doubt.
But I think they will feel an outrage that I feel about this, that this is happening, that they're lying purposefully to you to achieve genocidal ambitions, which is the worst thing possible, and that we're becoming complicit in it, and we're being told this, and this constant view of there are no innocents in Gaza, that they're all terrorists. And you and I, we've both been to Palestine and Israel. We've spent time in the West Bank, and you meet them. The Palestinians, they're real people. They're real people. They're nice people. They're very generous and hospitable. It's just the idea that they're just all bad. This othering of a people that is being done here in the United States, that I'm seeing so prevalent, that they're just all bad. I don't know what I'm trying to get to exactly here, but it's just, I don't know how we can fix that. And I'm furious that this is happening to so many Americans, that they're coming to this conclusion that, well, there's just this one group of people in the world, the Palestinians, they're just really bad people. And that's unfortunate, but that's just reality. We're seeing it. Israel keeps on telling us, and we got to help Israel against these evil people that live there. And it's, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. No, it can be depressing. It's true. I don't really have anything to add to that. I think what you said is very true.
Well, something that I've been hearing a lot, and I don't know if there's any credence to it, is the possibility of a civil war within Israel. There seems to be more dissent in Israel than there is here in America.
Yeah.
So do you know anything about this?
Right. There is a great deal of unrest. There is a very sharp division within Israel. A lot of anger against Netanyahu. One of the main issues, of course, is the hostages. Israeli society is obsessed with getting the hostages back home. And especially, you can say, kind of liberal, secular Israeli society. And they rightly regard Netanyahu as an obstacle to that. Because, clearly when there have been ceasefires and negotiations have been allowed to proceed, well, the hostages are returned. When war breaks out, more of the hostages are killed. It's just inevitable. You kill a lot of Palestinians, you're going to kill some hostages too. And the Israelis, the supporters of the hostages, understand that very much. So they're upset about this return to conflict that has happened. The renewed attack on the Palestinian population. Unfortunately, in the vast majority of cases, there's really no concern for the lives of Palestinians. It's about Israeli hostages. But it's more than that. Netanyahu has been attacking various institutions that are kind of held in very high regard, especially by secular liberal Israelis. The IDF is one. Shin Bet, that's their equivalent of the FBI. That's another. The judiciary, and he's attacked all these institutions. He's replaced. He's put a new commander in chief. He has a new defense minister. That's clear. But he also has a new commander in chief for the IDF, somebody who's personally loyal to him. So that's something that he's doing. He's throwing out the old guard, which was tended to be fairly liberal. Again, it's a mistake to think that liberal in Israel means that somehow you really are concerned about the Palestinians and you're not a Zionist. No, they're still Zionists. I think this genocide has been carried out by the IDF, and most of it was carried out under secular leadership. I think people need to be clear about that. But within domestic politics, they are on the liberal side, and they act as sort of a brake on some of Netanyahu's policies. They kind of have a check on his power, and he's trying to remove these brakes and actually consolidate his own power. So there's a fear within Israel that that has some validity that Israel is becoming less democratic. One thing is within it, Israel is a very democratic society. People, issues are debated very openly, and people are passionate about their political beliefs, and the elections there are very meaningful. And again, I think there is at least somewhat valid fear that Netanyahu is taking Israel down the road away from democracy towards an increasing, centralization of power in his own hands, and that's what we're seeing.
So do you think that we could potentially see some type of uprising within Israel?
Well, there's a potential for that. I mean, it would have to be now. It seems less likely now. I think first of all, the police apparently are firmly under the control of the far right within Israel. Ben Gvir in particular, that he's just one of the madmen in Netanyahu's cabinet. And the police, I understand, have really become politicized and become an instrument of that far right power. Now, the IDF, like I said, used to be secular, but and liberal, at least in its leadership. I think a lot of the soldiers, not so much so. But Netanyahu is working to replace that leadership with people that are loyal to him. So it's just the thing is, if you have a civil war, you need to have some of your own. You need to have some firepower, right? If you're going to fight on your side, and it kind of looks like Netanyahu is winning this battle. He has increasing control over the men with guns. We'll just put it that way.
Okay. Can you explain how damaging our support for Israel has been to the United States?
Well, it certainly has affected our reputation around the world, and it has made us look like hypocrites. We have portrayed ourselves as a champion of human rights. That goes back to actually President Carter in the late 70s, that he decided to pursue that policy. And it's something that's been continued, often very hypocritically. It was, no question, even going back to the Carter years. But this hypocrisy right now is breathtaking. We're actually, very much complicit in a genocide, and the world sees it. We don't see it. We don't, or refuse to see it. The vast majority of Americans, and it's also the vast majority of Israelis. I understand it's like these liberal Israelis are worried about these threats to their society. The loss of an independent judiciary and so on and so forth. It's something that has brought people out into the streets. But the whole world is looking at Israel and saying, these people are committing a genocide. And it's, I used to be sympathetic to them, but no longer. They have, their reputation has suffered greatly, but among the Israelis themselves and among the Americans, we're not seeing it. But the rest of the world is seeing it. And it makes us, it doesn't affect our military power, our hard power, certainly in the near term or the medium term, but it does have a real impact on our soft power. I mean, that the talk about human rights, well, often it was hypocritical, but there was at least a kernel of truth to it. Now people look at it and just say, this is just entirely bogus. These people are just liars. It's all hollow. And so our soft power, I think, has suffered a real blow. You still have a lot of people around the world that are just kind of almost worship the West, the American West, but that, but I don't think that is sustainable, past the near or medium term now.
Yeah, I imagine it has to have taken a severe blow. I mean, it almost makes me not want to live in America when I see what we're doing over there. It really is, it's something that I'm very ashamed about, and there's not really anything we can do. We live here in the Bible Belt in the United States, and it's amazing to me to see that evangelical Christians seem to be more fervent supporters of Israel and Zionism than Jews in America are. There seems to be some division within Jews. There's the Jewish Voice for Peace. We talked about young Jews are rejecting Israel, but it's not the case with evangelical Christians in the United States. And I'm just wondering, well, first, can you explain why that's the case? Why they have such a strong support for Israel? And then I'm also just worried about the impact of Christianity in the United States after this is all said and done. When this is over, when it becomes undeniable what has happened and what we've supported in Israel, what would that mean just for, this is supposed to be they say the evangelicals, we're a Christian nation, we're a Christian, and then it's like, oh, well, that's a bad mark. What will that mean? What will that do to our society and everything? I think there's we're going to go through a big crisis once this is over. That's something that I'm worried about here.
Yeah. Well, the reason that it's so prevalent among evangelical Christians in particular is Christian Zionism, which is something that developed independently of Zionism. And in fact, it preceded it only by a few years, but it did. So you had people advocating this particular interpretation of the Bible and of the end times, which flatly contradicted all traditional understandings that existed in churches, prior to the late 19th century. And at first it was a fringe movement, but it eventually, it spread, and then it really took off after the Six-Day War in 1967. And then one book in particular had a huge impact. I remember this book. I never read it, but I remember seeing it around and hearing about it. The Late Great Planet Earth. That was a Christian Zionist bestseller. And, it appeared in, I guess it was the early 70s. Or that's when it was really had a huge impact. Christian Zionism is, I would say, definitely it is a perversion of Christianity. It goes against all the traditional understandings of traditional interpretations of Scripture and the relationship of the Old Testament to the New Testament. I don't think we have time to go into it in detail. We did in a previous podcast. Maybe we can do it again in a future podcast. But it, essentially, for our purposes, what we need to understand here is that it teaches the Christians, the believers in this Christian Zionism, to support Israel, Jewish Israel, and to see that as an important step, or instrument in God's plan to bring, about the end of the world and the second coming of Jesus Christ. And so these people have been convinced of that. And, unfortunately, they're Christian virtues of compassion and other Christian virtues have been sacrificed on the altar of this. So you have Christians, unfortunately, these Christian Zionists that support a really bloodthirsty and, again, now I think we can very fairly say a genocidal program. I don't know how many, actually understand. I don't know. I can't judge each person individually. I think I'm sure many of these are good people, that if they really knew the truth would be horrified. Unfortunately, I think some of them actually just don't care. Probably know it's a genocide, but somehow think it's all right. Those people are just as guilty as as the Israeli Jews who know what they're doing and are perpetrating this genocide.
Do you think that there will be, how can we be freed of this, essentially? Will it be Iran? What does it have to end with the destruction of the state of Israel? That's kind of what, I feel like this is where we're coming to. If you go so as far as Israel's going right now with its campaign in Gaza, they've started bombing Lebanon. There's this huge push to attack Iran now. Where is this all heading? It seems like we're headed towards an ultimate clash. There's no way off of this right now.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way?
Well, it's certainly true within, with the current Israeli government is clearly trying to, attain all those goals. It is pursuing this really violent, almost apocalyptic program, and that includes, an attack on Iran. There's no question about it. That's not just, they're quite open about it, and they're really quite open about the genocide in Gaza. They're saying I think it was the defense minister, Israel Katz, that recently said that, well, either they can leave or there's going to be utter destruction, which means, we just basically kill them all. So it's ethnic cleansing either through killing or through displacement. And unfortunately, maybe in somewhat softer terms, but I think clearly Steve Witkoff was actually echoing the same thing. He was talking about displacement and utter destruction. He almost tried to make it sound like it was humane, but that's what he was saying. Anyway, that's an aside. So this is clearly the plan. It is the plan of the Israeli government. It's to, gain these territories through force, to wage war on its neighbors, in particular on Iran, and to do it with the unconditional support of the U.S. So, there's only two ways that I can see this ending. It's actually a defeat of Israel, inflicted, probably by Iran. That's really the only country that could do it. Or a change in policy within the U.S. because Israel can do these things only because it has the unconditional support of the U.S. There was some hope that maybe that was going to change with Trump, but Trump and his administration has made it very clear they're unconditionally supporting the course that Netanyahu has taken. If one day we have a real change, within this country, but it just does not seem, when you look at the forces, again, in the long term, I think we have reason to be hopeful because the younger generation is really rejecting Israel. But for the next few years, maybe next several years, I don't know how long this will go on. There's really not much reason to hope.
So do you really think that a war with Iran is likely then? That's really where we're heading?
I wouldn't say it's likely, but there's a very great possibility. But we have come close, like I've said in the past, to the abyss in the past. This is something that happens again and again. There are people that are just obsessed with Iran within the U.S. government, not just within the Israeli government, but within the U.S. government. And they have pushed us to the edge several times in the past, going back to the George W. Bush administration. And there will be an effort to do it again. It's just that, fortunately, there are realists, I think, particularly in the Pentagon, that understand how difficult this fight would be, and how much the U.S. military, how severely damaged it could be by this. Maybe in the end, we can inflict terrible damage on Iran, but at a great cost to ourselves. That's what we're looking at. Iran is not a third world country. Again, as we said, it's it's a technologically advanced country that has a history of resisting America going back to the 1970s, and has been preparing for this war. So for decades now. It's just not going to. It's going to be anything but a cakewalk. It would be we could see a widespread destruction throughout the Middle East, and which would include a lot of American forces, those that are based in Iraq, for example, and other bases on the Persian and the Gulf Coast, and they have the means clearly to shoot down our planes. There are these claims that have been made again and again. I heard Witkoff make it again that Iranian air defense has been eviscerated. I can't say for sure that that's not true, but I think that's highly unlikely. Because if we remember the last attack that was carried out by Israel, there was never evidence of anything, of any extensive damage. And it was just like over time, started to get these stories that would say, the Americans got this and this. And then it seemed like a whole month or 6 weeks later, they were claiming that they had eviscerated the air defenses. That seems to me just an information war and not real war. Again, we've never seen the satellite photos to back this up. And in the past, the Israelis haven't been shy about publishing satellite photos to prove, that they have achieved their objectives. We just haven't seen in this case. So I think it's highly unlikely. Again, the Iranians have, I believe, I can't know, but I believe that they have a robust air defense. And if America launched a full-scale, air attack in tandem with Israel, American planes would be shot down.
Can you expound on the disastrous consequences of a war with Iran? What the consequences for the United States? You were talking a bit about it, planes shot down or bases in the Middle East. Like, what could we expect as Americans,
Okay, well, yeah, those are the direct military consequences. Again, Iran is able to strike back in a way that, Iraq and other countries, Afghanistan, that we attacked, were not able to. When we got it on the ground, then they could fight, and we suffered losses, and it did not go well. But Iran is able to strike back in the air, and that makes a difference. So it has missiles, very precise missiles that can hit American bases, any American base in the region, and they've demonstrated that. They did a show of that after the Soleimani assassination. They struck U.S. bases in Iraq, but they were very careful not to kill U.S. soldiers. They were very precise. They hit empty buildings. They actually warned the Americans they were going to do this. They carried out this demonstration. But in a real war, they wouldn't warn the Americans, and they wouldn't be careful to avoid casualties. They would inflict casualties, and they would be severe. So there's that. But that's the military side of it. But then there's the economic side. It would be very, very easy for the Iranians to block the Strait of Hormuz, where a lot of the world's oil passes through. All they would need to do is actually just sink one super tanker there in the channel. It's quite a narrow channel, and that could block, all oil that regularly passes through that strait. And again, the consequences for the world economy would be huge. They can also, especially if the Gulf Coast countries are collaborating this, because the U.S. has bases in places like, UAE and Qatar. And if the planes are launched from those bases, then the Iranians would feel justified in actually striking back against them. They might, in any case, if it's an existential war, they're not going to worry about the feelings of the Qataris. They're going to strike the U.S. base there, and they can do it, again. So this is, and then if it's truly existential, they can also strike, the oil fields of these countries, and, especially again, if they are complicit in these attacks on any attack on Iran. And that, again, would have a huge impact on the world economy. So, altogether, it would really be a disaster for the U.S. And I think it would be a disaster for the Trump administration. I hope he understands that. It's just something that he said, we're going to keep, he's always thought that wars were a bad idea. He's spoken that way. And I think he's actually sincere, but he's taking himself down a road where he's going to, where he might find himself in a war that it will be especially have huge negative consequences for the U.S. and for the world.
Do you think countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, they would actually allow the U.S. to use their airspace, their bases to carry out an attack on Iran?
Well, the bases are there, so they might not be able to stop. I don't know. I don't know if they can forbid him from doing that or not. I know that, I think recently in the last attack, what I heard was that they refused to allow Israel to use their airspace. So Israel could not fly over Saudi Arabia or any of the Gulf Coast countries. Whether or not they can be allowed to launch planes, or they could prohibit that. Prohibit the launching of planes from the bases there. I don't know. I just don't know.
Do you think there's a good chance that now we have this resumption of the horrors in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, that Middle Eastern countries will rise up, that there will be, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon? Can we see something happen in the Middle East?
There certainly is a potential for that. There's no question that there is a great deal of growing, anger among the common people in those countries. Unfortunately, that you can have the common people. The common people may feel one way, but they don't have the guns, they don't have the control, and it may be possible for those governments with U.S. support. It's clear that they're subsidized by the U.S. Especially when I'm talking about Jordan and Egypt. They may be able to keep a lid on it, but I don't think forever. At some point, it just the anger may boil over, and we might have a revolution in either of those countries or both of them. And
right.
Then, that could really change things. Now, they still militarily they're going to be quite a bit weaker, but Egypt has something like 100 million people. It's a very poor country, but it's very populous, and 100 million people is just against Israel, which has a Jewish population of, what is it?
Maybe 7 million.
Yeah, 7 million. That's what I was going to say. It's something that obviously poses a huge threat to them. If that happens, that could really change the balance of power. That Egypt used to be in an alliance against Israel, but that ended, of course, as a result of the Camp David Accords which actually happened under President Carter. And then essentially what the end result was that Egypt was bought off, kind of the U.S. that paid a huge bribe and continues to pay that bribe every year in the form of very substantial foreign aid and support for their military.
It's crazy how we do that, spend all this money overseas to protect Israel, instead of just telling Israel, you have to establish some real borders. We have to get a two-state solution. We can't just have the state that's forever expanding, and then we have to keep on supplying you with military aid and then bribing all your neighbors so that they don't try to fight back. This is, we talk about just the anger that's growing in the Middle East, but I think there's just anger throughout the whole world. I mean, I get angry all the way here in Tennessee. This is, it's frustrating. I don't think that, I think that it will boil over. I don't know if they can keep a lid on it. Just if people around the world in Europe and the U.S. are feeling this angry, I mean, just imagine if you're there
Yeah,
in Egypt or if you're
right.
in Jordan. I mean, we've both been to Jordan as well before. I mean, it's half Palestinian. Those are
Right.
Palestinians that live there. And Egypt, there's a huge millions of Palestinians there too. Um, it's insanity. Is it wrong that I almost want this war with Iran just because I feel like it's the only way to rid the United States of this Zionist control of the Israeli parasitic relationship. Like I don't want to see Israelis massacred. I don't want to see them wiped out. But I don't want this relationship that's been so damaging to my country and to the whole world and to all the millions of people in the Middle East that have been killed as a result of our involvement in the Middle East at the behest of Israel. This just isn't okay. It's not acceptable. It can't go on forever. And the way that you were talking about it, you said that Iran is really the only force that could do that, or if there's a change within the U.S. government. But that just seems like hoping for some change within the U.S. government is just it's a pipe dream. Maybe in 50 years when the demographics have changed here in the United States. But I just don't know if we can
Yeah.
wait that
Hmm.
long and how much destruction will continue in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It,
Well, I think, you may be right about the 50 years, but it might not be that long. I mean, it's just that so much is happening, and as it becomes increasingly apparent that that the people that lead Israel are fanatical, um, genocidal maniacs. I mean, I really don't think that's an exaggeration. I'm not just calling them names, but people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich are really could be accurately described in that way. And it seems like that is the rising power. Again, these are the people that are taking control of the institutions of Israeli society. And increasingly that cannot be hidden. It's one reason, of course, I think that young Jews are turning away from Israel in this country. And it will be harder and harder to hide that reality from the rest of the world, including the U.S. And as the genocide proceeds in Gaza, at some point, we've already seen it at the margins, and actually significantly at the margins here in this country, and it could go at some point faster than we expect. So maybe it's not going to be 50 years. Maybe it'll be 5 years. I'm just trying to be somewhat hopeful, because I think that's really that would be the best solution to the problem, that the United States change course. I think a war between both Israel and the U.S. on one side and Iran on the other side would result in a lot of devastation. It would be, and in the end, it wouldn't result in the overthrow of Zionism. It would just mean a lot of bloodshed all around. I'm afraid that's really what the end result of that would be. Um, the I think the best solution that we can hope for is a change of policy. If the U.S. makes clear to Israel, if it removes its unconditional support and says, we are not supporting these expansionist policies anymore, this has to end. If we really got that from the U.S., I think that would also have a huge impact on Israeli society. One of the reasons that these maniacs really have taken power is because they know they have this unconditional support. It's something that we've seen actually, in also in Ukraine, where I think it's much less likely that the ultranationalists would have the power that they have today if it weren't for U.S. support. If the U.S. had say, hey, you got to work something out with Russia, then it's like the people that want to go to war, they just wouldn't have an argument. You say you're going to go to war on your own against Russia, it's because they can say, well, and we have the U.S. at our back, and so that they're able to persuade people, of the rightness or the feasibility of their policies. And this is, so we see that in Ukraine, we're seeing that in Israel, and in Taiwan too. There's something similar. You have, I don't know if you want to call them ultranationalists, but the independence movement that does not wants to reduce ties with China and break away. That's why they call the independence movement. They would be much less powerful if they didn't have the U.S. at their back. And because that's something that they bring up again and again. It's like, don't worry about this. The U.S. is, at our back. The U.S. will protect us if China ever attacks us. So, we can go down this independence route. We can break away from China. They wouldn't say that. Nobody would listen to them if the U.S. wasn't there. The U.S. in every case just empowers the extremists, the ultra nationalists of different types, within these countries. And if the U.S. actually were to withdraw its support, and then we could see a change within these society. It wouldn't be immediate, but I think it would be fairly fast. Those ultra nationalists, those extremists, would have the rug pulled out from under them. And we could see those societies undergo, a transformation as they realize, hey, we got to actually deal with our neighbors. It's like, we can't just depend on military force and, with the backing of the U.S.
I mean, I can see that happening in Ukraine and in Taiwan, that we stop giving so much support and have a change of policy, but I just don't see it happening with Israel. I mean, we saw it with Biden, and now we're seeing it with Trump. I mean, it's getting worse, I think, under Trump. I mean, I just saw Pam Bondi is calling pro-Hamas supporters, labeling them as domestic terrorists now. And I'm just thinking, like, this conversation that we just had, where we expressed our sympathies for the people of Gaza, could we be classified now under Pam Bondi's definition as domestic terrorists? And that's terrifying to think that this is the country that I'm living in, where we are proponents of peace. We don't want to see people die. We don't want to see war. And seeing our country supporting, enabling a genocide in Gaza is not something that I want to be part of. And I think it's my duty as a citizen of this country to speak out against it. And speaking out against it now, this administration is saying that I might be a domestic terrorist. Like, this is crazy. It's and the same thing with Iran, Hezbollah, I mean, the Houthis, all these people labeled as terrorists. And then you try to say, like, okay, well, really, Hezbollah is a terrorist? These were the groups that were protecting the Christian communities against ISIS and al-Nusra. The Houthis, when have they ever carried out a terrorist attack against the United States or anybody? They talk about, okay, the attacks on the shipping lanes. It's like, well, the solution isn't to bomb the Houthis, it's to abide by the ceasefire, because the Houthis have shown themselves to be honorable. Once they said, okay, well, unless, as long as you continue this genocide in Gaza, then we will affect Israeli and Israeli-linked shipping. And then as soon as the ceasefire went into place, they stopped. And then once the humanitarian aid and they cut off the electricity to Gaza and stopped honoring that ceasefire, they said, okay, we'll resume it again. And it's like, instead of saying, like, well, we got to stop them from shipping, it's like, obviously the easier solution here is to say, Israel, hey, turn the lights back on, stop the killing, allow humanitarian aid in. But we don't do that. It's just, it's absurd. And these terms of who's a terrorist and not a terrorist is infuriating for me. These definitions that are being thrown around. It's like, who's the one killing women and children? 70% of the people killed in Gaza are women and children. This has been stated again and again. I think BBC just came out again saying, 70%. And Steve Witkoff has to know this. He said he got in a helicopter and went around. You see the wanton destruction. It's clear that nothing's targeted. I just saw videos yesterday of them of a refugee tent city just being bombed. It's like, this is what you're going to say they're Hamas tunnels under this refugee tent. Even if you say there's one Hamas leader in there, does that justify wiping out all these families that are living here because you already destroyed their homes? It's unbelievable to me that in this day and age, 2025, where we have all this information at our fingertips, this thing is being live streamed, that this is allowed to happen. How is this illegal? How is this allowed? Nobody's doing anything. The only people with any balls to do anything are the Houthis. And then we get really mad at them. I just don't understand how this is acceptable in today's day and age. Like what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, is awful. And like I hate that, but these are armies fighting predominantly. There are
Hmm.
obviously some civilian casualties, but these are real armies, and that's different. When you see just so many dead children, toddlers, as a father of a 1 year old and a 3 year old, and I see pictures and videos of babies that are with limbs missing, that are blown
Mm.
apart, shredded. It's like this is just there's nothing more openly evil in the world than that, and it's being broad live casted to the world, and nobody's doing it. And we're here as Americans saying, as this government here in the United States saying like, oh, these are the terrorists, the babies that we're killing, the children, the women and children we're killing. We got to support Israel no matter what. It's actually so bad. The one country that's trying to stop this, the Houthis, Yemen, we got to start bombing them. And we're telling Iran that they got 2 months before we start bombing them too. And then right now they're bombing Lebanon as well, which Lebanon used to be a predominantly Christian country as well, and there are a lot of Christians still there too. So it's infuriating for me seeing what's supposed to be a Christian nation, the United States, and these evangelical Christians supporting just like the destruction of anything of Christianity throughout the Middle East. Supporting people like Al Jolani now. It's just like this is, I don't know. It's depressing, and I
Hmm.
just want it to end. And then that's why I said like maybe Iran is the one that's going to free us from this and end this all. But like you said, I should not hope for that, because that would open up
Yeah.
such a huge other can of worms.
Right.
We could destroy our relationships with Russia and potentially trigger something there. With China, all of a sudden, the whole world is just in flames. Maybe it leads to nuclear war. But why can't the U.S. Why can't we just say this is wrong? We can just we don't even have to tell. We're not even saying Israel. You got to go back to the Bronx in New York, or back to go back to Europe or whatever. We're just saying just stop. No more munitions. You have to settle this diplomatically. You have to work with the Palestinians. Your policy objective can't be just ethnic cleansing, that we have to remove more and more. I mean, they just approved another 3 settlements, I think, yesterday in the West Bank. I mean,
Yeah.
they're just, we talk about Gaza, but this is happening throughout the West Bank. They've taken land in Lebanon, they've taken land in Syria. This is the hypocrisy of, we're talking about territorial integrity, oh, Crimea, whatever. It's like, but when it comes to Israel, they can just continue forever. And it's just, this isn't okay. And I just want Americans to wake up. I want the evangelical Christian Zionists here to understand what they're supporting and what they're doing. And I just want this to end. And it won't. It won't end.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm afraid I just don't see a happy ending no matter what. Again, it, the truth is that if Israel finds its back against the wall and its very existence is truly threatened, if it's losing a war with Iran, for example, I think it would exercise the Samson option. That means, the Samson option is the idea. Well, if we're going down, we have they have, I think, at least 200 nuclear weapons. That's the most common estimate that I hear. We're going to attack the neighboring countries. Even there's supposed to be a bomb that's that will target Moscow. That's something I heard decades and decades ago. I don't know if that's still there, but yeah, it could end up with a nuclear holocaust of some kind. So that's the thing. It's just like, yeah, I can. Sometimes I find myself thinking the same thing: hope against hope. Maybe the Iranians could really teach them a lesson. I'm afraid that it'll just unleash new horrors, and for the Iranians themselves. Again, the best thing would be, I think the only hope is really a change within the U.S. and a removal of that unconditional support. I think that could force the Israelis to wake up. It would be like a slap in the face, and they could actually begin to negotiate with their neighbors. Even though I understand that is probably a very naive hope, but I just don't see a whole lot of hope in this. I don't. I mean, that's the sad truth. It's just a very, very unfortunate. That's using a really euphemism, an unfortunate situation that's just going to end very badly. Yeah, I wish I could have some, some sort of reassuring statement, but I don't. I just don't in this case.
What a depressing mess. Okay. Well, I guess we can end it there. Anything else you want to add, Dad?
Um, well, I don't really need to add anything more. I mean, we talked about part of the Witkoff interview. We actually talked about the Middle East part, which was the first half of it. And then he spent maybe 20 minutes or so talking about Russia. And that's the part that actually attracted the most attention, because he did say things that, flatly contradicted the narrative. And I found that interesting. But we could do that tomorrow. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
Or not
Okay,
tomorrow,
yeah,
rather, but in the next episode, right?
on Wednesday, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was encouraging to see, but like you said, when he was talking about the Middle East, it was difficult to listen to.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well then let's end it there
Okay,
then.
sure.
Okay. Have a good rest of your day, Dad.
You too.